Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. And now we have just one feline friend. We recently lost another cat. So I'm married cat man. We had 5 cats when I met my husband and moved to Tuscaloosa. And now we have Miss Ashley. She is the conquering kitty. She's 17 years old and she's still with us. It's an honor to be your closing keynote speaker. I want to thank you all for being here. Thanks to Bethany, to Mike, to Richard, anyone else I may be forgetting, including the wonderful people who checked me in today. I'd like to address how I came to do some of the things many of us are really interested in doing, and that is explore our shared past. And I do that, fortunately, I get to do it a lot at Alabama because that town has a lot of antebellum history, and that's my core area of expertise. And I get to do it with a lot of wonderful people, including ones who have been here and some who are still here, like Sonia Harwood Johnson, and I believe Steve Murray, and my other friends, Scott in Montgomery at the Department of History and Archives, they're here as well. They've all been so supportive. As I share in my latest book, I am not a public historian, but I happen to do some things that resonate with what public historians are interested in, so much so they've welcomed me. Still, I resist the title because I know there are many people who have formal training in what is a very formal discipline, and I respect that training. I am, however, a historian, a former newspaper journalist with a graduate degree in dance, who made a living off of visual art, believe it or not, who's made films. And if you followed all that, I'm mostly just me. I'm a storyteller more than anything, and I just happen to be lucky enough to do it as a professor, okay? So I don't know what you're seeing because I can't see the screen, but know that one of the reasons why I continue to bring the arts multidisciplinary approach into my work, one, because of my husband, Dr. John Beeler, who's here today. He's one of my senior colleagues, and he said limbs are made for climbing out on, and so I often tell my students to join me as we go and explore our shared past in that way. But I also remember my doctoral advisor, David Roediger, his words. He is a well-known race and labor scholar who is my doctoral advisor at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And he told me to bring your whole self to your work. I think I'm able to move. Is it moving? Okay. Hey, that's my new book, y'all. You can QR that if you want. Actually, just ask your favorite library to buy the e-copy because most people buy chapters. But let's get to, and that's all my former jobs. I used to work for the Detroit Free Press, the Columbus Ledger-Inquirer in Columbus, Georgia. I see it, yeah. And the Miami Herald in my hometown. I even wrote for Essence magazine as a freelancer. There's me as a dancer with my lovely classmates in Greensboro. And there's my first book that began as just some drawings in my journal. And my then husband said, I think you should find an agent. And I was really fortunate to be able to sell that, and it got a lot of coverage. But when that book was published in '97, if you weren't in Oprah's book club within a month, you were considered a failure. So I went beyond that book and started painting and was fortunate to find a gallery. But all of what I just shared is not my way of boasting, but it is a way of letting you know all the things that I bring to the table as a professor, but more than anything, as a storyteller. Dr. Roediger, who really prefers us saying Dave, in fact, if you call him Dr. Roediger, he'll say, call me that one more time. Anyway, he told me early on, bring your whole self to your work. And he possibly said this because he could see the pitfalls ahead for me as I moved forward. He knew that there would be moments when I would not fit the mold for what some people thought a professor should be, as I would be called on to do this or that, as many of us are, in ways that often leave us weary. Richard and I were talking about that just a few minutes ago. We love the work that we do, but sometimes we're very exhausted. So facing that particular challenge, one of the things I learned early on, in an academic setting, especially in Tuscaloosa, the thing to do is to embrace not only teaching, but embrace the town I call home, because it is filled with so many historic sites. I'm from the South. I love being outside. There's my grandma, my maternal grandmother. We used to fish on Lake Okeechobee together, and I like being outdoors, so why not take my students outdoors? I like to move. I like to get the happy hormones going. Do we read books? Well, I assign them. Do they learn? Absolutely. And to put a face on what some of this learning looks like, I'm going to show you a video, but let me sort of get acquainted with this slideshow one more time. So that's my grandmother, who's no longer with us. She inspires so much of what I do. She's from the Mississippi Delta, Belzona, if any of you from Mississippi. And there I am near the Black Warrior River in Tuscaloosa. And here are my students, making, in one case, a music video that premiered at the Jemison Van de Graaff Mansion in Tuscaloosa. And if you know anything about that mansion, it is the first dwelling in Alabama to have indoor plumbing. But I'm going to tell you some more about it momentarily. So here's the video. If we can get it playing, know that the students gathered footage, and it premiered in this mansion.
Wasn't me. How could it be? I gambled all my wealth away in this small town. It only took a day in Druid City. In Druid City. You know I never had a brain for a nice day. They always say, I forgive you, it's all I've got. But I still hope that you rot in Druid City. In Druid City. In Druid.
So I want you to know that there's a reason why I allow you to see them taking on their hats and taking off their hats. I wanted you to see the joy in these young folks. They were only supposed to pose for a moment while I gathered the footage, but I was like, you know what? When I was editing it, I just felt so alive when I saw them be goofy afterwards. So I said, let that be part of the narrative. Sometimes we need to smile and need to laugh because we are dealing with a lot of difficult narratives, and that's something I'm going to spend more time with. The song is called Druid City. It's named for the oaks that used to be in Tuscaloosa. The band's name is Bible Study. We're here in the South, and some of us love Bible study. Okay, so throughout the course of my 13 years at Alabama, I have found a lot of value in working with some amazing people, including some of my own students who helped me find meaning in our shared past. I use Tuscaloosa as a lab or a laboratory to learn about that past. And I say shared because I want to immediately break down barriers. We can all agree that we come from some other people, okay? We can all agree that the past is shared. We all descend from people who lived long ago. And that automatically gives us a common reference point. We didn't just arrive here on a spaceship. We emerge from cultures and distinctive traditions that are part of a larger historical process. And I say as much as a native of Miami with ancestral ties to the Bahamas, the Mississippi Delta, and northern Alabama, Southwest Georgia, if I didn't say it, where my great-great-grandfather was a full-blooded indigenous person. My more immediate past, and there's my students in Moundville, and there's me as a little girl. Remember those aluminum trees? I want to get to Grandpa. He is on what would be my right. He's the guy leaning. My more immediate past, and the thing that drives me, includes my grandpa. You saw my grandma, here's my maternal grandpa from Indianola, Mississippi. He grew up playing marbles with a little boy named Riley King, who grew up to become a man we know as B.B. King. And grandfather was a sharecropper when he saw an old beat-up bus in the Mississippi Delta. And he asked the white man who owned it if he could buy it, but he didn't have the money. But he said, if you let me fix it up and take out of work sharecroppers, turned migrant workers to Florida to pick pole beans and tomatoes, I'll slowly pay you off. This is Jim Crow, Mississippi. And the white man said, yeah, I can do that. And so my grandfather began to do this. He'd take workers down to Homestead, Florida, and they'd pick crops, and he'd bring them back to Mississippi with the goods that they'd maybe buy for their family. And at some point, he and my grandma got to learn to love what Isabel Wilkerson has called the warmth of another sun. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, this same grandpa pulled me to the side, and he told me that there were good people in this world, and there were bad people in this world, and not all the bad people were white, and not all the good people were black. And I didn't think much about what he meant back then. I had no idea that it would drive so much of what I would do as an adult. I simply said, yeah, Grandpa, and I went on my way. I had not yet experienced a lot of pain. But now as I approach my 60th year, I've had both joy and pain, as the late Frankie Beverly has sung about. A lot of challenging moments that I could have never imagined in my formative years. My mom a retired social worker, used to talk a lot about who we are during our formative years, and this is how I circle back to being your whole self, okay? That's where I started. The core of you, your whole self, begins in those formative years, about 6 years old. The core of you is there. The core of me was spent in Coconut Grove. It's a little small community that's actually older than Miami, Florida. And the Grove sits by a bay, okay? And there was, like many areas, a black side and a white side, okay? And as true of Alabama native Zora Neale Hurston, who was raised in Eatonville, Florida, outside of Orlando, I didn't have a lot of, I'll just be honest with you, white people around me against whom I could judge myself as being inferior. Aside from Dr. Kason, the white pediatrician who called all of the African American children in the Grove my babies. There was Miss Elizabeth Vyrick, a white woman from Kentucky who was an activist who was really dedicated to erasing slum conditions for African Americans in Miami, with Father Theodore Gibson, an Episcopalian priest from the Bahamas. So, my mom has dementia now. If I say, Mama, do you remember Miss Vyrick? Who doesn't know Miss Vyrick? Or if I say, Mama, do you remember Father Gibson? And she'll say, who doesn't know Father Gibson? So these are two very important people from my childhood, okay? So, of course, I'd see people for whom my grandmother might clean house or do some babysitting. And this was before she learned to master all of these Caribbean recipes after my mom married into a Bahamian family. And she became known as Bahama Mama on the food festival circuit in the 70s and 80s. Okay, at one point, she was even feeding the Miami Vice crew conch fritters, conch salad. Some of you know about the shellfish, right? And she'd do so with my grandfather beside her. And there were moments when we'd actually go back to those homestead fields where they used to be workers. And we'd pick pole beans and tomatoes to even sell at the farmer's market. And there were moments when, by the time I got to high school, my best friend and I would pick strawberries, and we actually had the privilege of choreographing, say, a dance for our pom-pom team while throwing strawberries at each other, things that our ancestors could not have even dreamed of doing. So I was among a group of African Americans who helped integrate in elementary school. There's Grandma and Grandpa, the festivals. My art teacher was a Holocaust survivor. This is all the whole of me. I'm still with that, and we're going to get to the shared messy past. She saw something in me and made me stay after school and draw a lot and paint a lot. And once I won an honorable mention for some contest that was sponsored by Crayola crayons and Reader's Digest. That tells you how old I am. And I still don't know what my daddy did with that $125 check. But back then, and this is really important, and this ties in with the whole self and Grandpa saying they're good people and bad people and they're not all blah, blah, blah. No one made much of the color of my skin in that elementary school that we integrated. I don't know why. This is North Miami. A lot of my classmates were from Jewish people from New York, but a lot of them were just regular old white folk. And they were just like, they're here, the two buses with the black kids. And every day, this little blonde girl with freckles would wait outside the school for the two buses bringing the African-American kids, and she'd reach for my hand. And her name is Beth, and we joined Girl Scouts together. And NPR helped us find each other. And we discovered that though time had separated us, miles hadn't. Can you believe she's a professor in Louisiana and I'm a professor in Alabama? And we gathered our husbands together and we met halfway in Jackson, Mississippi, and we now follow each other on social media. So this is who I bring into the classroom, someone who has experienced pain, certainly, but someone who was just permitted to be Sharony. That's the human being I take into the Jemison Van de Graaff Mansion, well aware of our difficult shared past, okay? Early on in the semester, I will tell my students in upper level classes, if we stay in the classroom more than we are out of it, I have failed you. What you need to know about the antebellum period is out there, outside of our classroom. And by the way, History department is in Tin Hor. It's a Cold War building that doesn't get all the money like the School of Engineering and School of Business. And my husband calls it the puke hole. So I definitely want to get out of that building. So outside we go, and we go to the Jemison Van de Graaff Mansion, which was built by, and please hear me say this, enslaved artisans who often worked without oversight. This is the first dwelling with indoor plumbing in Alabama, and it was built on the eve of the Civil War. It is a place that was regularly visited by Horace King, a man of African and indigenous descent who was once enslaved, and he learned how to become an architect via his then master. Okay? That's enough to make my head spin just saying it, because I have to repeat this story over and over, and my students are, once they, take in the beauty of the mansion, go, "What did you just say?" Yeah, they work without oversight. So, Robert Jemison Jr., this was his town home. He was a slaveholder, businessman, politician, Confederate politician who worked with Horace King. And they helped the South modernize even before the Civil War. I would not want to go back in the past the way Marty McFly did, right? Time travel and meet Robert Jemison Jr. Hardly, because he was a man of his times. But he is someone who's part of our messy shared past. I invite my students, and I now invite you to think about all these potholes. We have to start unflattening the histories that we are so interested in. I think more and more of us are doing it. There's so many nuances that we need to spend some more time with, because it might help explain our messy shared present when some folks don't do everything you expect them to do. And scientists know that our blood pressure actually goes up when things are not black and white. When things are gray, we're kind of confused because we go, well, wait a second, what do I make of this? And so I invite my students to spend some time thinking through this relationship that Jemison had with Horace King. But if you only stop with those men, you're going to miss King and how complicated he was all by himself, because he himself was a slaveholder, and not just because he wanted to help his family members, but he owned none other than J. Sella Martin, a black man he reportedly flogged, and here's Martin, so much that Martin left the South, becoming a renowned abolitionist who spoke a lot in England. So you have to kind of wrap your head about how we get to that, and those enslaved people working without oversight. And there are other stories lurking in that mansion, which is just a short drive or long walk from our campus. Jemison relied a lot on Priscilla Cherokee Jemison, his wife. And already Cherokee should be alerting you to the Native people who took care of her and nursed her back to health when she was a child. We often hear the story of Southern belles sitting on a porch, right, drinking mint julep tea while some enslaved person is fanning them. Well, Priscilla certainly benefited from a lot of privilege and being married to a wealthy man. But she happened to do her husband's books, and he owned a lot of plantations. So my students, when they go into that mansion, they get to go into her office and sort of sort through who she is in this difficult period. And let it always be heard, if you don't hear anything else, slavery was awful. And the trauma that many experience lurks in the present day. We know that. The late sci-fi writer Octavia Butler says we actually carry our ancestors in our bloodstreams. But something else lurks around us. And as a historian, I take pride in knowing that the archive, or surviving letters and legal documents and so many other things, even the stories, the oral histories that get passed down, like the ones that my grandpa and grandma shared, allow us to see these nuances. And if I may, my first book addresses the ways in which Black women strategically found favor with white slaveholders before the Civil War. And before she died, I told my grandma, this is what my book is about. And she said, that ain't new, and And then I learned, and if I may, that my great-grandmother always had groceries in our house in Mississippi because Mr. Ray, and this is not easy to say, who was the Grand Wizard of the KKK, loved her collard greens. And my mom said whenever they would walk past Miss Diamond's dress store, Miss Diamond would step out and say, "Hello, girls. Tell Miss Luella y'all can come in and get anything y'all want, because Mr. Ray said so." But I'll tell you one thing, when it was time to go down to Homestead in Miami, my great-grandma was the first one running to that car. So these are very strained transactions that lurk in our nuanced past, okay? So my students have also visited the Old Tavern Museum and the nearby ruins where the state capitol building once stood before it became a school for young women after the state capitol moved from Tuscaloosa to Montgomery. In both dwellings, we get to think not only about Tuscaloosa's beginnings on the Black Warrior River, but the native people who were removed from the area. Okay, nearby Moundville Park broadens that narrative. But I can't say it enough. I am really struck by how young women at Alabama in my classes really want to know more about the roles of women in our shared past. And they get to learn about Sarah Gale, a South Carolina native who married John Gale, who was the governor of Alabama when the university opened in 1831. And she left behind a diary that my late colleague, Dr. Sarah Wiggins, the first woman to get tenure in the history department in Alabama, co-edited. And in that diary, you're going to hear a woman who's going on and on about her unhappy life in the last 5 years of her life. The diary was one way that she made sure that her daughters were prepared to survive the patriarchy surrounding them. And to be clear, when my students also visit Gorgas House Museum, the oldest dwelling on our campus as it was built in 1829, even before the university opened, they learn the story of Amelia Gale Gorgas, a woman who was at one point UA's nurse and librarian and postmistress, okay? Following the death of Josiah Gorgas, her husband, who was UA's 8th president, but he died, and she needed to feed her kids. And the students especially love going into Gorgas House, and the director of that house is here with us. Sonia really helps us do some amazing things. So I've watched the students engage these spaces and others, but one of the most memorable students is a young woman from Texas who, when given a chance to walk and sit on those ruins from that state capitol building, lifted her arms as if she was a warrior, lifted her arms as if she was a wrestler, okay? And this was her way of reclaiming our shared past and insisting that she was part of another kind of future. She'd heard about Sarah Gale, that so-called Southern belle, who wanted to safeguard her position, who once wrote about the man she owned, who wanted her horse when she needed it. She heard about Sarah Gale going on and on about her husband selling her enslaved people to pay off his drunken brother's debts. And she certainly had a lot to say about the students at UA who kidnapped a servant and dared the sheriff and his 15 to 20 assistants to come to campus and rescue her. This is part of that old violent Southwest that we learn a lot about. So my student inserts herself into this narrative, whether she's celebrating Sarah or herself or a host of people, I don't know. But when I pointed my smartphone toward her, that was her response. They learn about these stories long before our campus began recovering the history of slavery at the university. Many of us have done so with regularity following the efforts of my colleague, Dr. Hillary Green, a former UA professor now at Davidson College. It was she who first embraced this campus slavery topic, not only as a teaching initiative, but as a research and service initiative. And please stay tuned for her forthcoming book. Now, my students have also learned about Nathaniel Kenyon Jr., the Union officer and POW, who had been captured during the 1862 Battle of Fort Donelson. And he ends up on the very site of our present-day Embassy Suites Hotel. That's where we have a POW, well, at least the POW camp was located. So why do we care about Nathaniel Kenyon? Yes, it opens the door to conversations concerning the Civil War and power flux. But in his diary, he lets us know about a Negro woman who makes biscuits and pies that he enjoys. And he enjoys her food so much, the Confederate officers around him take away that privilege. But I want to center the story with this woman when I teach. And I ask my students, we need to think about whether or not she was free or enslaved. Was she able to keep her earnings? Let's sort through the autonomy she had working in that POW camp. We don't know those answers, but we know she existed because this diary, this archive, allows us to see her. We get to see how within the confines of her desperate state, she maximized the moment, possibly. And in sharing these ideas, I introduce my students to James Scott, a political scientist anthropologist who, during a visit to an Asian peasant village during the Vietnam War, observed the everyday behavior of poor folk. And he decided that the big fights, those all-out confrontations, are worth documenting and talking about. But most of us are more interested in how we survive the everyday. And so I invite my students to do that. How did she get over? Even the Irishman who was discriminated against after arriving here penniless because he was Catholic, he had to find a way to maximize the moment. And he did so by realizing he had some currency in the color of his skin, okay? So who knew that in entering this building and that building, all of this history could come to life? Whether it's 75 minutes or 2.5 hours, we try to make it happen. And as we step out on these limbs, and as I try to teach like this, a lot of organizational skills are involved, a lot of storytelling is involved, my historical training is involved, and even though people go, there they go on another field trip, I keep doing it, okay? I keep doing it because my advisor told me to be my whole self. He saw this mid-career student who had been a former journalist, who liked to draw and paint, who knew how to dance, even though I couldn't dance as well as my classmates who were half my age at UNCG. I was also someone who saw the Twin Towers fall. Indeed, that was my journey to academe. I was working as a freelancer in New York City. And on that day, no one said, "How do you vote?" before helping the next person. Something similar happens when I stand at the door at the end of every semester as my survey students leave, and I wish them well, whether it's a Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, or if it's Happy Summer. I say thank you. I say thank you. I say thank you over and over again. And many of them stop and say, "No, thank you." Sometimes I'll go, "What did I do?" And they'll just shake their heads and say, "Thank you." And I recall now a student who was the president of his fraternity. He was one of the ones that the girls called eye candy. And here we are on the quad, and you can see the president's mansion is in the backdrop. And this young man, who I didn't know was special, he's just another student, but they giggled. Oh, how they giggled whenever he had something to say. Well, one day we decided to play football on the quad. And the idea here is that I wanted the students to think through how we historicize leisurely moments. How do we get beyond the Protestant work ethic? Now, I could talk about it all day, but let's go out there and get sweaty. Let's play football. And while some of his classmates are playing, and he's right there playing, he pulls me to the side and he wants me to know something. He wants me to know that the previous summer, his dad told him that he wasn't going to sit indoors with the AC in his dad's big company. He was going to go outside in the heat and be with the workers, black and white. He began to talk to me about a particular worker with whom he took cigarette breaks. And they had something that's not easily named. They had a shared past. They had a shared present. And I listened, and I didn't say anything. I did nod a bit. And what I could tell my student was really wanting to say is, I met a black guy. I met a black guy, teacher, and I think he became my friend. And I was really proud that we had created something that allowed him to be that open before he went back out to play football and leave all the girls giggling. The same thing happened when I asked Bryant-Denny Stadium if my class could use the stadium as a classroom to learn more about our shared past. I wanted my students to think through how Nick Saban, our now retired coach, found a way to get a team made up of young men who mostly did not look like him to trust him. So it was after the Auburn game, after the season ended, they knew we weren't going to tear up the grass. They said, yeah. And we had a good time. We went into the locker rooms. They got to touch Jalen Hurts' locker. They even got to go into the room where the press conferences are held. And the students decided who was going to be Nick Saban. And they picked a young African-American classmate. And boy, did he know how to look grumpy. He had us howling. And then came the moment when I asked them to all close their eyes. I think about something they wanted to put in their rear view. And then think about what they wanted to see in this world in the days ahead. And we were going to run through that same tunnel that Nick Saban and our team ran through. And we did it. And it became a clip on ESPN. Doing all of this stuff, learning how to be your whole self, at some point requires you to be authentic, requires you to be vulnerable. Students know when you're not being honest and true. And when you are being honest and true, and you are being authentic, they go out on those limbs with you. They sort through our crazy past and crazy present together with you. So back in New York City, I want to go back there for a second. After the towers fell, I'm the girl who decided if the world's going to come to an end, I'm a freelancer, I'm going to have fun first. And this is one of the reasons why I ended up in Greensboro, North Carolina, and got the grad degree in dance and got the PhD in history, blah, 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 blah. But while I was in Greensboro, and there's us on ESPN after running through the tunnel. While I was in Greensboro, I used to take pleasure in walking through the Guilford Courthouse Military Park. I wouldn't just look at monuments. There's a real forest here. And I would call my mom every week while walking through this forest. And my mom, a native of Mississippi, thought her child had just lost her mind. You're walking through a where? And I know she's thinking about the moments when we hung from trees as strange fruit. But I could feel the past in this forest. And one day I filmed part of my thesis project in that very forest. And this was after spending a week in Stockholm, where I worked with the late filmmaker, choreographer Danya Foyer, a protege of Ingmar Bergman. She asked me to record her work with Danish and Swedish children embodying Shakespeare, and we'd make up the rest as we go, and we did it. And I made this experimental film, and here's one still from it. And I thank her for giving me that opportunity. And I thank, of course, my then advisor, John Gamble, one of the pioneers in contact improv. Those two people also taught me how to be my whole self, to be authentic. And I bring all of that into the classroom. And here is a young woman who stepped out on some limbs with me, Jennifer Jackson. She was an undergrad at UNCG. We worked in that forest, and we worked in the classroom. Now, 3 times now I've said, maybe more now, be your whole self, be authentic. I invite students, not just from my classes, but from the campus, to join us in doing these things. And sometimes we do so in our campus' oldest dwelling. This is Gorgas House Museum. We participate now. This will be, if we do it, Sonia, next spring, our 4th time doing Slow Art Day. Slow Art Day is a moment when hundreds of museums and galleries all over the world, even in Ukraine, spend one day slowly looking at one thing. Whether it's a painting, an object, or something else. So in 2023, my husband, an avid vinyl record collector, he installed an installation at Gorgas House Museum. Now, this is an antebellum dwelling with hundreds of vinyl records, and we had this sci-fi thing going on, and students lined up, and I'd never seen so many people from around the campus enter this historical space. And I can tell you more about what we had set up as we invited people to think about our shared past and think about Amelia Gorgas's son, William Crawford Gorgas, who helped eradicate mosquitoes, enabling the building of the Panama Canal, basically revolutionizing transportation in the Western Hemisphere. Some of those vinyl records probably came through that canal. More than anything, I wanted them to know that who knew that a building that we bypass daily while walking to class was a place where a little boy grew up, became a man who did something so important. This installation also had beadwork that some of my students were asked to do while I was lecturing to them about this or that. And one of the reasons why I get them to do creative stuff is because we're all breathing through a lot. And I've noticed that my own breath changes when I'm beading and when I'm painting. Okay? Who can keep up at this pace? And so I get them to sort of calm down with me. All right? And sometimes I take breaks. There's William Crawford Gorgas right there. I recently, and there's his mom Amelia, did what I call the Last 4 tour. You can't see the picture underneath, but it's me on top of a mountain in Hawaii. Before I turned 60, I wanted to see the last 4 of the 50 states I had not yet visited. Those states were North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, and of course I ended up in Hawaii. And as is true on my campus, I never met a stranger. In Fargo, I met a bartender at the Holiday Inn who gave me the best homemade mushroom soup I ever had in my life. In Hawaii, I befriended a mother who suddenly lost her 7-year-old son shortly before meeting me. And together with her 12-year-old daughter beside us, we walked up a mountain to see a waterfall. And it was so hot that day, I actually didn't make it all the way to the top. But I did stop where a lot of people stopped, and that was near the bamboo. We were sort of, warned, if you don't make it, stop where the bamboo is. And there we peeped through the bushes and we saw a waterfall. And we did this with all kinds of stuff surrounding us, the headlines that we're living through right now. And as I chatted with people I met while sitting and catching my breath, I remembered to continue being my whole self, to be authentic. I also remembered to keep asking myself, how can I make this world a better place? And this is sort of where I want to end. Sometimes I just say, what do I do with all this stuff I'm learning? It's one thing to take in this information and then look for the next social media posting or look for the next text message. It's something else entirely to say, what do I do next? And sometimes, as my husband knows, I have taken bundles of flowers from my yard to the VA hospital down the street. Sometimes I do these paintings on found wood and I take them down to the VA hospital. And sometimes I go to a local high school in Tuscaloosa. And on the eve of seeing the publication of my book on Zora Hurston in Honduras. I did so by going to this high school where most of the students are from Central America. And I told them about this African-American woman who lived in Alabama before spending her formative years in Eatonville. And she was as weary as I have been. So weary, she went down to Central America on the premise of finding a lost Mayan ruin. But she really wanted rest, something we all want. And I gave each student in one class a copy of my book. Yeah, I was like Oprah, and you get one, and you get one, and you get one. And to be honest with you, only a couple of students raised their hands to talk. But it was only when I told them that one of the other things I do is write screenplays, and that I actually place in contests, and that one day maybe this story was going to end up on the big or little screen, that they lined up to take selfies with me. And then I told them all I could sign their book and put their names in it, or I could just put my name, because maybe if I made that film happen, they could sell the book. And this book was more important and certainly worth more money if only my name was in it. And I was really shocked to see how many kids heard me. And I said, "Do you want your name in it?" And they said, "No, only your name." And I wondered how much money they needed in their day-to-day life when they weren't in school. And I did something else, and this is where I really close. I gave them all an oyster shell. Last Christmas, my husband and I were in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and somebody put it in my mind that I could go skating again. And I did my rock skate bounce moment for a bit, and all of a sudden my hands went up in the air and I fell. It's something to fall when you're 8 years old, or even 12 years old, but not when you're in your 50s. So of course everybody ran over to me and I got the bless your heart, and you bless your heart, you know how we do down here. And I decided I was going to start picking up oyster shells to get people to know that I was okay. And let me tell you, my hands were burning because I landed on my hands and my rear. I could barely undo my skate laces. But I got enough oyster shells to wash, put glue in, and then put a little glitter in, a little bling. And then I put a little note that said, "Fake it until you could make it," just like Dr. Green on Christmas Day, meaning I'm going to act like this doesn't hurt right now, I'm just going to push through. And they were all excited about getting those oyster shells. So I'll leave that with you. Fake it until you can make it if you're as tired as I am, but more than anything, bring your whole self to your work as we step out on limbs and think about our shared past. Be authentic. And I know that you're already doing something with what you've learned. I just want to encourage you to maybe be mindful of what you're doing with what you're learning, because I have to constantly remind myself of the same, because sometimes we're really robotic about these things. And if I were on campus right now, I'd say, "Roll Tide!" But now I'll just say, have a good evening, and thank you for spending this time with me. Does anyone have any questions? You gonna let me off easy? Well, there are a couple of answers to that. Again, we're living through a lot right now, and you have to find new ways to get them to open up. There was a time when you saw in the video there were like 10 students, but now my classes are much bigger, and Sonia knows we were just in there and we had to do 2 different tours because there's so many students. But there was a time when my husband would get a UA van, I would get a UA van, he'd let them listen to Cardi B. And we go to Mountainville. These days, Alabama, 65% of our students are from out of state. These kids got money. They want their own cars. So imagine wanting to go to Moundville, and you're rolling up with your class. You got 30 vehicles, as we say, rolling up into Moundville. And that kind of does something to the closeness that you're trying to build in the classroom. So one of the things I try to do is GroupMe. Some of you know about that app. Try to get them to join GroupMe. Some students already have a GroupMe. This is an app where students can talk to each other, probably share answers. But if you're a professor, you can actually go on the offense. I got my own GroupMe. And maybe you're going to learn something if you join it. And so one reason why GroupMe works is because they can reach me immediately if they need me for any reason, if we're on a field trip off campus. Some of them may have something serious going on in their lives. There are moments when I have given out my phone number, but GroupMe creates closeness. And I tell all of them, you don't have to reach out to everyone in the group. Maybe there's someone sitting next to you in class, and you've shared a pen or a pencil, and you know that person's name because you've seen me return their papers, and maybe you're going to reach out to that one person via GroupMe because you can do a direct message. And I noticed that if more and more, some of my students will email me and say, if I'm not going to make it to class today, is it okay if so-and-so gets this paper? And there was a time when they didn't even know my name, let alone their classmates' names. So that really helps too. Another thing I get them to do is, and we're going to start doing this now because we're moving into the fifth week. We're building trust. They have so much they want to say, and they know how to say it, but they're afraid to raise their hand. So I take their papers and I get them to swap, right? And that helps them to open up. When we were at Moundville last year, which was the last field trip, they all had to complete a sentence, but someone else had to read what they wrote. And I recorded them and gave them a link to it on YouTube and told them to listen to what everyone said 5 years from now. Only they could hear it. Of course, we have a wonderful donor, Kathy Randall. I just wanted her to know what's happening at Alabama, and I sent her the link as well because I watched the Moundville, I guess you'd call it a curator person. She was crying listening to what the students were saying. But I also sent it to Kathy Randall. I just said, I just want you to know what's happening in the history department. And she said that was just amazing. Because by the end of the semester, they were open. And I was really proud to see them stepping out on limbs. So yeah, as you slowly get them to be vulnerable. And they're young, they're resilient. If they know that you're being real, they'll meet you halfway. Most of them do. Most of them do. Once they get, the hair is another thing. I deliberately, sometimes I say you can get extra credit if you tell me how many times I changed my hair this semester. So it'll be like blue hair, it'll be big hair, it'll be, I don't know, gold hair, who knows? And so when they see you being your whole self, and my whole self is this crazy creative person, then they go, Dr. Green doesn't take herself so seriously. Also, I say I'm from the South. If you call me Miss Sharony, I know I've earned the right for you to call me Dr. Green, but I just love hearing, oh, Miss Maddie, you can call me Miss Sharony if you want. And I'm surprised by how many who are from the South, they'll go, Miss Sharony, I'm like, hey. So that builds warmth as well. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.